Hey everyone, it's the Nitty Professor. And the other day when I was looking up some material on kindness and crafting, I stumbled across a reference to soft power. And I thought, what better time to address the need for soft power than a time when the opposite is being wielded with not a whole lot of discretion, in my personal view. So anyhow, Joseph Nye came up with this idea of soft power in contrast to, I guess, hard power. And there's some interesting connections between that and fiber crafting specifically. And as I kind of ramble on here a little bit, I'll probably end up relating it to other activities that I and others of you are involved with that can also sort of fit this pattern. But, something like knitting, it doesn't really happen often that it looks revolutionary, which can be a little deceptive, right? Because soft power actually is a thing. And for that reason, knitting kind of, so to speak, slips past defenses because people sort of associate it with benign, powerless women, people who aren't necessarily out there trying to make us think about things. When you think about it, something like a sock like this, it doesn't argue, right? A lot of effort goes into it, a lot of thought, a lot of tradition, but it never really fights with anyone. However, what it can do is change the emotional temperature of a relationship or even a community. It's something like this is soft. The things that it is associated with, domesticity, care, feminine, dare I say, attributes, it can definitely warm up a relationship. And, if we start thinking about power per se, like what is power? Well, we think about it as domination. But what if it is influence over people? Influence over what people believe is normal. Influence over what people believe is desirable or human. Influence over what people believe constitutes or contributes to flourishing, one of my favorite words in philosophy. And Joseph Nye developed this idea of soft power to denote the sort of influence that's achieved through attraction, through culture, through values, and through legitimacy, as opposed to coercion and force. Now, obviously, coercion and force historically can lead to, dominant culture, legitimacy, and all that good stuff. So I think it's important to, figure out where the thread needs to lead us versus, alternative kinds of scenarios. But in any case, so soft power has to do more with attraction, more with building like value systems and consensus and, feelings of connection, I think. And that's sort of the domain that fiber crafting tends to work in. It doesn't work in the arena of domination. So if we want to look a little bit more deeply into how that could play out as far as, number one, changing the emotional climate, the emotional temperature. When you think about it, I even can think about this in terms of my dog. If I wrestle him or yell at him, I can compel his behavior. It's kind of what's going on now globally, right? We're not going to go into a lot of details, but soft power can reshape what feels acceptable, what feels moral. It can add its own sort of contours to that. A handmade object, as I said, it can alter the emotional tone without argument, generally. I mean, is there room for possibly, oh my God, you made that? Or, so it's not like 100% guaranteed. But just in general, I think when we're talking about handmade objects that are given away or handed down or even made for oneself, there's a kind of a warmth, like warm fuzzies, that are sort of connected to that. Receiving something knitted or crocheted or a quilt, usually, right? I think generally, without exception, It conjures emotions of gratitude, maybe even reciprocity, like, gee, I should have done something for you, or even vulnerability because of the things that it speaks to. It speaks to our vulnerability to harsh weather, to want, our need for clothing and shelter, and that kind of thing. And when we're operating in that sort of emotional domain, then hostility is a good deal harder to sustain, which could be a really good thing. I think everybody who's in the negotiating room at the political level, if they were all sitting there knitting, imagine how the world could change, right? I mean, I think that would be so awesome. Just teach all those people to knit and then sit them down to negotiate about this or that, military, economic, whatever. I think the temperature would be a lot different from what it is going on now with the way negotiations unfold. And even just inserting the idea of kindness in here, it's not so much about winning debates as it is about lowering the social temperature that cruelty thrives in. So it's just a lot harder to be cruel and hostile when people are making soft, fuzzy things for one another or for others. Another thing that we can attribute to craft is the opportunity to normalize care as a social value. It's very easy to normalize strength as a social value, to normalize violence as a social value, to normalize force. But when we're crafting, we're normalizing care and kindness as a social value, and maybe even beauty. I mean, look at that, right? It's kind of pretty. Again, soft power, soft values. And care is a very skilled labor. It's not like it's worthless. I mean, it takes a lot of know-how to understand how to care, to understand other people's needs, and how to communicate and respond to those needs and do so in a way that validates people's dignity and that shows them respect. I think it's also important in this context to normalize interdependence. And I see this a lot, this whole idea in, the class I'm teaching now in my special education class about educational methods, how important it is, even when you're working with a disabled child, to show them dignity, to show them respect, to give them choices, to respect their humanity. And when you sort of understand other people from a standpoint of their vulnerability, it's just a lot easier to be kind to them. So that's kind of a little illustration in a nutshell of how that can unfold. Another thing about making for other people is it's admirable. People, they look up to you. Again, I think if those people in the negotiating room in that golden whatever were there at the same time as they're duking it out with their debate, if they were making something with their hands for the homeless shelter downtown, we would admire them a lot more, right? Then they're sitting there, they're just looking after their own need for wealth and stuff like that. Over time, we might argue that communities that are exposed to visible care practices, like what is done in knitting day in public, they begin to assume that mutual support is the baseline expectation. Not competition, but care and mutual support. And competition is just, it runs rampant, especially in American society. I think Western society generally. I suppose it's everywhere. But, crafting communities are, generally speaking, a good antidote. I've never seen any of our Fiber Guild meetings take place where people were competing to see how fast they could spin or how much they could knit in a given time or how many sweaters they could churn out. No, we're just there enjoying each other's company. And some people are knitting for themselves, some people are knitting for charity, but it's just about, kindness, good vibes, and it's not about cutthroat competition. That has its place, right? But soft power does too. There's also a reason to want to value influence without threat. And it's quite possible to influence people. even as a musician, I think about the orchestra concert that we had the other night, and we were playing on this video game music, and we were appealing to people's hobbies, to people's enjoyment, and we were even espousing values. Like I said, the guy who was talking about kindness as a result of the video game Undertale. I think we influence people at those events, especially when we get up and talk about why we're playing. A year or so ago, we had a Native American group called Brule that we played with, and my goodness, they really added a lot of talk to the music that they were playing and appealed to the audience to invest their hearts as well as their minds into the cultural event, their understanding of particularly Native American culture, but also the role generally of music in bringing people together. And I think that's true for fiber crafting too. It's influence. It's definitely influence, but there's no threat involved, generally. I mean, if you know some exception to that rule, I'm sure it's out there, right? People complaining, oh my God, why do you use acrylic? Or, oh my God, that exists. We're not like perfect, but generally speaking, I think crafting communities offer the opportunity to influence people in a positive way without necessarily triggering their defense mechanisms. When you think about a protest sign invites opposition, and there is such a thing as protest involved in fiber crafting. I've seen it back in the George Floyd days. But when you think about it, a knitted baby blanket really doesn't invite a whole lot of opposition. So there is a much greater potential to invoke feelings of kindness and non-competition, non-threatening influence in fiber crafting communities than there is in, the community in Washington, D.C. So, yeah, there are charity knitting groups, community repair circles I've seen, especially, not so much here. I live in a small town, but in Minneapolis, man, I saw all kinds of really cool organizations that supported quilting, textiles, fiber crafting, anything associated with needle art, etc., and even public yarn installations. I saw that in Toronto as well. They all tend to demonstrate social priorities in a way that feels welcoming rather than confrontational, especially when you talk about yarn stores that have, knitting circles that meet on a regular basis. They can really do a lot to promote a sense of community in wherever they are. It's almost like a kind of persuasion through lived example. You're living out your persuasive capacity to move people towards the notion that making things out of a sense of care, self-care, care for others is normal and valuable. We can also talk about soft power and the idea of building trust networks with regular in-person gatherings. I certainly trust the people who I am guild members with, and I don't know all of them deeply, but the moment I walk into that room, it's like I feel like those people are my friends. And it can even be to the extent of cross-generational interaction, like when we do demonstrations. One of the demonstrations that I like to go to a lot is it's the James Valley Threshing Show. It's in Andover, South Dakota, and we do these little demonstrations. People bring their families, they bring their kids, and we're sitting there and we're spinning, mainly, sometimes knitting. There's a quilt show there, and people come and they ask questions. They're like, oh, what are you doing? Sometimes they can relate to what we're doing, like maybe they saw their grandmother do that, or they actually do it themselves, or the kids want to try it, and we're sitting there. In a way, you could argue that we're sort of performing, but what we're really doing is inviting people in and building an atmosphere of cooperation, of collaboration, of mutual respect, of sharing, and cross-generational interaction. It's a really cool thing, and it's something I enjoy being involved with, especially when you start having these conversations. And I have no idea what the political persuasion of those people is, but boy, they really do value traditional crafts, regardless of their, what their thinking is about, for example, the current war. And these networks, they kind of serve as like an informal civic infrastructure. Really, they are a part of civil society, which involves a lot of other components, including education. But getting people together, talking with each other, and sharing values such as traditional crafts, that's a really important aspect of civil society. It builds social bonds, and those bonds are the ties that strengthen communities and enable them to withstand polarization, to withstand crisis. For all I know, those people that I meet and talk to, we could be really polarized if we weren't talking about spinning. It's quite possible. But we're talking about spinning. We're talking about crafting. We're building community through soft power. And I might be able to inject something about my novels about marginalized people, or, something about the Underground Railroad, or, just toss something out that might strike a chord with somebody and influence them in a way that I personally would see as positive. Certainly like to push people towards acceptance of diversity, equity, inclusion, right? All those great things. And when you're talking about groups where trust already exists, that's where soft power can really grow. That's where it can grow. And the crafts are it's like a seed bed, it's like the fertile soil where that can grow. Another thing that's cool about soft power, that's kind of related to NICE framework, is how it can reclaim narrative authority. So when we talk about mass culture, all the commercials that pop up when I'm watching Greyhouse, for example, I'm like, oh my God, I gotta turn the volume down. But mass culture can frame worth in terms of productivity, youth, even visibility, being part of the majority culture, whatever. But fibercraft, specifically, music, I argue, can do this too, can counter this by elevating a more diverse group. For example, older people, maybe disabled makers, or potentially, slow learners. Can also elevate domestic knowledge, women's work. And another thing that can be really valuable in elevating what the soft power can elevate through craft is tactile intelligence. We're so oriented towards sight as a modern species, and sight tends to be the most exploitative sense because you can see something far away and decide to colonize it. But when you are talking about what you sense by touch, it's only that which is proximal, that which is near you. And while there's a lot of room for, the whole notion of love at first sight, I think love at first touch is maybe a more worthwhile or desirable, or I'm trying to figure out the word, valuable kind of love, you have to, like, there's nothing like hugging somebody. Let's just put it that way. And experiencing people and relationships through touch, experiencing art through touch, I think has certain advantages over privileging our sense of sight. Tactile intelligence. It's a cool concept, isn't it? I should do a video just about that. And there can be, when you see people, I think about these artists I've been talking about lately who are respected makers outside dominant power hierarchies, like, for example, Bisa Butler. It can have an effect of shifting cultural legitimacy, of just pushing it in a different direction. So away, for example, from male-dominated, site-dominated colonization and toward more feminine-dominated, tactile-dominated compassion and affection, which could be really cool. Now, here's another thing that's really interesting to think about. As an example of what I'm about to tell you, my kids and I received quilts when we joined a church way back in the day. And every time I see those quilts, I associate them with the people who made them and what they were expressing. So arguments, hopefully, will fade. They don't always. But a lot of times they fade. They go away. We forget them, especially if it's an argument that kind of maybe isn't of a critical nature, On the other hand, objects, the things we make, they stick around, right? They stick around. And because they're more connected towards kindness and compassion, giving, charity, and that kind of thing, they can have a lasting positive impact on the connections between us. So, for example, a scarf that was knitted when someone was ill or maybe had a baby, or even, a hat crafted for the purposes of protest, or I think of the Memorial AIDS quilt, for example, or the works of art that I talked about that Bisa Butler made to celebrate, African Americans from 100 years ago. Those objects are like a form of memory storage. They are evidence. They are still there. They're hanging around, and they're still evidence of the people who passed and the relationships between them and the people who loved them, and consequently crafted something for them in their honor, in their name. It's almost like a kind of inherited testimony. So crafting and the tangible objects that result from it can have, again, this kind of soft power influence over culture that can be extraordinarily conducive to flourishing. And it operates across time, which is really cool. Handmade textiles, they can carry values forward long after political rhetoric disappears. And that's kind of a cool function. It's true of a lot of art, but I think it's especially true of art that is centered more in community. And it reminds me of book 4 in my novel, which is about this whole crafting circle from a previous century that comes back to life in memory because of documents that are found by the current characters in book 3. By the way, I'm closing in. I'm finishing my edits to book 3, making progress, y'all. It's a long one. I'm trying to cut out some stuff and make it so that it's a really delicious read. So just so you know, I'm making good progress. Now, here's another aspect of soft power relating to kindness and reputation building. And that's something that I emphasize, that soft power depends on credibility. So if a community becomes known for generosity, if it becomes known for good works, then it gains a kind of moral authority. Sadly, the United States, we used to have that with USAID, and it was just brought to a stop. And I think it really hurt our moral authority. When you have that moral authority, and let's hope it can be restored, because I think it's really critical. But people listen a lot more readily to groups that have that kind of moral authority. Again, even small crafting circles, that do things for charity. They have a voice that people want to pay attention to. Even things like, the United Way. It enables cooperation. Things like, Homes for Humanity. And a lot of times a kind of organic leadership emerges in those kinds of communities that is much more sort of democratic and much more effective, because it's, it's like leadership emerges in a way that matches people's values and aspirations. And fiber communities at their best can accumulate this kind of authority, because at their best, their authority is attached, their identity is attached to the idea of generosity. It's not attached to dominance. So they kind of figure in this whole idea of soft power. And again, I like the idea of, this idea of radiating it out from fiber groups. And again, I think of the orchestra that I'm in, how much, we've been around 100 years. It has a kind of respect. People come to the concerts. Like the last concert we had, there was a huge snowstorm at the beginning of the day. We didn't even know if anybody would come. Well, they came in droves. And they gave us a standing ovation. So and there's a lot of free tickets involved. Kids can come free, students can come free. Tickets are really affordable, and we collected money to pay for the players to come in from outside and the parts that we don't have, like harp players and filling out string section stuff. We raised like $7,000 with conductor contest, just because people are so supportive of that institution. So it's just another great example of soft power and how it can influence community identity in a really positive way, because it's not based on dominance at all. Attention, right? That is another kind of political currency. Fiber groups sort of take attention and they reallocate it towards concepts of maintenance, comfort, even endurance, repair. Those are things that come out in my novel as well. Just to give you a example in a nutshell, if you choose to spend 40 hours knitting something to make someone warm, like could be my son, as opposed to using those 40 hours to optimize my own personal gain, it's like I'm modeling a whole different hierarchy of values. And by doing that, we fibercrafters, we might find other people want to emulate that. We may be able, again, to exercise this kind of soft influence and spread this soft power through the mechanism of imitation. So this can all, tying into my last video, it can feel kind of subversive. I think it can feel very subversive based on what we're witnessing right now in the world stage. Soft power is the opposite of the kind of polarized environment right now that thrives on outrage, thrives on speed, suspicion, and zero-sum thinking. And we're surrounded by that. And we just desperately need an antidote. And I think fibercrafting is a really good antidote because it fosters patience, it fosters abundance thinking, and it fosters cooperation, it fosters compassion, it fosters attention. And it kind of erodes in the, if we're fortunate, it can erode the cultural conditions that sustain harshness. There's kind of a paradox in that, fibercrafting, it can seem very private and it can seem remarkably apolitical, and maybe it is. However, by gathering together and meeting with friends, knitting in public, meeting with our guilds, fibercrafting continuously produces the very social cohesion on which democracy itself depends. Again, going back to civil society. So y'all keep crafting out there, spread the word, let people know what you're doing. I don't think you have to go out of your way to function as a role model, a soft power influencing role model that others may want to emulate, and just help to make the world a little bit better. Y'all take care. Ciao.